The city that had conquered the world was burning. On August 24th, 410 CE, a woman stood at the window of her villa on the Esquiline Hill, watching flames rise from the forum below. She was perhaps 30 years old, born into a senatorial family that traced its lineage back 5 centuries to the days of the Republic. Her ancestors had governed provinces, commanded legions, shaped the destinies of nations. She had grown up believing in certain permanent things: the Senate, the legions, Rome itself, eternal and unassailable. The smoke rising from the city centre carried with it the acrid smell of burning cedar, temple doors perhaps, or the wooden scaffolding of the basilicas. Mixed with it was something sweeter and more terrible, the scent of burning flesh. She had closed the shutters against it hours ago, but the smell seeped through every crack, inescapable as the reality it represented. Her villa, once a sanctuary of marble columns and mosaic floors, now felt like a trap. The servants had fled 3 days earlier when the Gothic army first breached the Salarian gate. Her steward, a freedman who had managed the household for 20 years, had urged her to leave with them. "Domina," he had said, his voice shaking, "the barbarians will show no mercy to your rank. Better to hide in the catacombs among the Christians than to wait here like a sacrificial lamb." But she had stayed. Not from courage. She felt no courage now, only a numb fascination. She stayed because leaving meant admitting that everything her family had stood for across 20 generations had become meaningless in the span of 3 days. She stayed because the alternative was to abandon the physical space that connected her to 1,000 years of Roman history, to walk away from the busts of her ancestors lining the atrium, to become a refugee in her own city. Now she watched Gothic soldiers moving through streets that had not seen foreign warriors in 800 years. The screaming had mostly stopped. What remained was the sound of systematic destruction, timber cracking, bronze statues being toppled, the distinctive crash of clay roof tiles shattering against stone. Occasionally, a woman's shriek would cut through the other sounds, then fall silent with terrible abruptness. From her vantage point on the Esquiline, she could see the Subura below, the crowded working-class district now emptied of its inhabitants. Some had fled. Others had barricaded themselves inside tenement buildings that would become their tombs if fire reached them. The Gothic soldiers moved methodically from building to building, not with the frenzy of uncontrolled rage, but with the purposeful efficiency of men executing a plan. A cart rumbled past her villa gates, piled high with looted goods, gold candlesticks from churches, bolts of silk, amphorae of wine. The Gothic warriors pulling it laughed and shouted to each other in their harsh Germanic tongue. One of them glanced up at her window. For a moment, their eyes met. He was young, perhaps 20, with the fair hair and blue eyes of the northern peoples. His face bore no particular malice, no triumph, no shame. He looked at her with the same casual interest he might give to a stray dog, then turned back to his companions and their cart of plunder. That look shattered something in her. She had expected hatred or lust, or even respect, the acknowledgement of one warrior culture recognizing nobility in another. What she received instead was indifference. To him, she was not a representative of senatorial dignity, not a daughter of Rome. She was simply irrelevant, a fixture of a world that no longer mattered. Her husband had left 3 days earlier, riding north to Ravenna where the Emperor Honorius had barricaded himself in the marshes. He would not return. She knew this with the certainty that comes from watching the foundations of reality crack apart. The roads between Rome and Ravenna were controlled by Alaric's forces. Any messenger, any traveller, any Roman official attempting that journey would be captured or killed. Her husband, Senator Marcus Aurelius Fortunatus, who had spent his entire career navigating the intricate politics of the Senate and the imperial court, had ridden directly into his death with the naive confidence of a man who believed his rank would protect him. She wondered if he had realized in his final moments that titles meant nothing anymore, that Senator of Rome carried no more weight than citizen or slave when faced with Gothic spears, that the entire edifice of Roman social hierarchy, so carefully maintained, so fiercely defended, so completely believed in, was a fiction that could evaporate in the face of simple military force. Everything she had believed about the permanence of Roman power, about the invincibility of the greatest empire in human history, had revealed itself as illusion in the space of 3 days. The question forming in her mind as she watched her world burn was the same question that would haunt the empire's final decades, the question that historians would wrestle with for the next 16 centuries. How does something that appears eternal end? How does the unthinkable happen? In the distance, she heard the crash of another bronze statue falling. She knew which one, the statue of Marcus Aurelius in the Forum, the philosopher-emperor on horseback, symbol of Rome's golden age of wisdom and stability. She had walked past it 1,000 times, had learned its history from her tutors as a child. Cast in the reign of Aurelius himself, it had stood for over 2 centuries, surviving civil wars and political upheavals, a constant in the shifting landscape of imperial politics. Now it was on its side, probably already being broken apart for the valuable bronze, its symbolic power as meaningless as her family's lineage. This is a story about that question, about the slow unraveling of the most powerful civilization the Western world had ever known, about the men who might have saved it and the decisions that doomed it instead, about the moment when contemporaries realized that their world, vast, complex, seemingly permanent, could actually die. Before we go deeper into this collapse, I want to ask something of you. If you're finding this compelling, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely matters and helps me continue making these long-form documentaries. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you in a place that was once part of this empire, or somewhere that watched its fall from afar? Now, to understand how Rome fell, we need to understand what Rome was before the cracks appeared. We need to see the empire at its height to grasp the sheer improbability of its collapse. In 117 CE, under the Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire reached its maximum territorial extent, 5 million square kilometers, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of North Africa. Somewhere between 55 and 70 million people lived under Roman authority, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, yet all bound together by a single legal system, a single currency, a single administration. Imagine standing in Rome at this moment of maximum power. The city itself held perhaps 1 million inhabitants, by far the largest city in the Western world, and it would remain so for over 1,000 years. The population density in the crowded insula, the multi-story apartment buildings, exceeded that of modern Manhattan. The noise was overwhelming, merchants hawking goods in a dozen languages, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the rumble of carts on stone streets, the calls of animal sellers, the chants of religious processions, the thunder of chariot races in the Circus Maximus, where 250,000 spectators could gather. The physical infrastructure was staggering. 11 aqueducts delivered over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water daily, more than many modern cities provide. The baths of Trajan covered 11 hectares and could accommodate thousands of bathers simultaneously, offering not just bathing facilities but libraries, gardens, gymnasiums, massage rooms. The Colosseum, completed under Titus in 80 CE, seated 50,000 spectators and featured engineering so sophisticated that it could be flooded for naval battles or fitted with a retractable awning to provide shade. But Rome was merely the symbolic center. The true marvel was the integration of the entire Mediterranean world. The empire had existed in some form for over 1,000 years if you counted from Rome's legendary founding in 753 BCE. It had been an empire in the formal sense for 200 years, since Augustus had transformed the Republic into the Principate in 27 BCE. 4.5 centuries of continuous rule. No living person could remember a time before Roman dominance. The Mediterranean Sea was called Mare Nostrum, our sea, because every shore touched by its waters belonged to Rome. A standardized road network of over 400,000 kilometers connected every province to every other. You could travel from Britain to Syria using Roman roads, paying with Roman coins, protected by Roman law. A merchant in Alexandria could trade with a merchant in Londinium with reasonable confidence that contracts would be enforced, that banditry would be suppressed, that the infrastructure connecting them would remain intact. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A merchant ship leaving Alexandria with a cargo of Egyptian grain, Syrian glassware, and Indian spices could sail to Ostia, Rome's port. There it would be unloaded by stevedores who spoke Latin and Greek, checked by customs officials using standardized weights and measures, taxed at predictable rates, stored in warehouses protected by Roman law. The goods would then be distributed throughout Italy on Roman roads by carters who could travel safely without private armies, stopping at way stations spaced at regular intervals, crossing bridges that were maintained by imperial engineers. The merchant could then take his profits in standardized silver denarii and use them to purchase Italian wine, Gallic pottery, or Spanish olive oil, confident that his coins would be accepted anywhere in the empire at roughly equivalent value. This system required extraordinary administrative sophistication. Tens of thousands of officials collected taxes, maintained records, administered justice, supervised public works. The empire operated a postal system, the cursus publicus, that could deliver messages from Rome to the Rhine frontier in 2 weeks. Census records tracked population and taxable property across millions of square kilometers. Legal codes, continuously refined over centuries, governed everything from commercial contracts to marriage law to inheritance rights. This was not merely the largest empire the Western world had known, it was the most administratively sophisticated, the most economically integrated, the most culturally influential. Greek philosophy, Roman law, and later Christian theology formed a civilizational synthesis that would shape European thought for millennia. The empire was not just powerful, it appeared to be the natural and permanent state of the world. Romans themselves believed this. They spoke of Roma Aeterna, eternal Rome. The poet Virgil had Jupiter prophesy that Rome's empire would have no end, no limit in space or time. This was not mere propaganda, it was genuine conviction born from centuries of evidence. Rome had survived the sack of the Gauls in 390 BCE, it had destroyed Carthage, it had conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, it had weathered civil wars and incorporated the entire Mediterranean basin into a single political structure. Why would such an entity ever end? The empire's military strength seemed unassailable. Approximately 450,000 soldiers organized into 30 legions plus auxiliary forces, guarded frontiers stretching thousands of miles. The legions were not merely large, they were professional, disciplined, technologically advanced. They built roads and bridges, constructed fortifications, maintained siege equipment that could reduce any city. Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube posed raids and occasional problems, but they lacked the organization, resources, and technology to seriously threaten Roman power. A Roman legionary was not simply a soldier. He was a skilled professional who had trained for months before ever seeing combat. He could march 20 miles a day in full armor. He could construct a fortified camp every single night while on campaign, a complete defensive position with ditches, palisades, and organized streets built in just a few hours by men who had done it hundreds of times. He could operate complex siege engines, maintain his equipment, follow intricate tactical formations. He served for 25 years and upon retirement received a land grant that made him a small landowner, creating a class of veteran farmers who formed the backbone of Roman society in the frontier provinces. The legion was not just militarily effective. It was a civilizing force. Legionaries built the roads they marched on, the bridges they crossed, the forts that grew into cities. Castra Regina, Vindobona, Colonia Agrippina, dozens of modern European cities began as Roman military camps. The legions brought Roman culture, Latin language, architectural techniques, and urban planning to the provinces. Germanic tribes that fought Rome one generation might send their sons to serve in the legions the next, beginning the process of Romanization that transformed barbarians into citizens. The economic foundation appeared equally solid. Egypt and North Africa supplied grain that fed Rome and the major cities. Mediterranean trade routes moved olive oil, wine, pottery, textiles, and luxury goods in volumes that would not be matched until the early modern period. The tax system, while often harsh, generated sufficient revenue to maintain the military, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure. The currency, the silver denarius and later the gold solidus, was accepted from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The sheer volume of trade was extraordinary. Hundreds of merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean during sailing season, carrying millions of amphorae of wine, oil, and grain. The merchant fleets required to transport Egypt's grain tribute to Rome alone numbered in the hundreds of vessels. Archaeological evidence reveals the extent of this commerce. Pottery shards from North African oil amphorae appear in excavations from Scotland to Iraq. Glass from Syrian workshops appears in Britain. Spanish fish sauce, garum, was consumed in Germania. This was a genuinely global economy, at least within the Mediterranean world. Socially, the empire had evolved sophisticated mechanisms for incorporating conquered peoples. Roman citizenship, once limited to inhabitants of Italy, was extended to all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 CE by the emperor Caracalla. Local elites throughout the provinces could join the Roman Senate, command legions, govern provinces. A man born in Spain or North Africa could become emperor. Several did. This was not a simple extraction system. It was a genuinely cosmopolitan political structure. The cultural synthesis this created was unprecedented. In Syrian Antioch, Greek-speaking intellectuals debated Stoic philosophy in bathhouses built by Roman engineers, while in the marketplace merchants traded goods from Scandinavia to India. In North African Carthage, rebuilt after Rome's total destruction of the Punic city, Latin poets composed verses while looking out over a harbour filled with merchant ships from across the empire. In Gallic Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Celtic tribal aristocrats sent their sons to receive Roman educations, learning Latin literature and law while maintaining their own religious shrines and cultural traditions. This was not uniform cultural imperialism. Rome had no interest in erasing local cultures. Provincial cities maintained their local languages, gods, customs, even governing institutions. What Rome demanded was acknowledgement of imperial authority, payment of taxes, and participation in certain civic rituals that affirmed loyalty to the emperor and the empire. Beyond that, vast cultural diversity existed within the imperial structure. The empire had weathered crises before. Civil wars had erupted periodically, most dramatically during the year of the four emperors in 69 CE, when four different claimants fought for the throne. Yet the fundamental structure had survived these convulsions. The legions remained loyal to the idea of empire even when they switched emperors. The administrative apparatus continued functioning. The economy recovered. In 193 CE, 5 different men claimed the throne simultaneously, plunging the empire into civil war that lasted until 197 CE. Septimius Severus, victor in that struggle, was an African from Leptis Magna who spoke Latin with a Punic accent. Yet he ruled effectively, expanded the frontiers, increased the legion's pay, and founded a dynasty. The empire absorbed the shock, adapted, continued. So when people speak of the fall of Rome, they are describing something that seemed impossible to those who experienced its height. They are describing the death of an entity that appeared as permanent as the landscape itself. The first sign that this permanence might be illusion came in 235 CE, and it came not from external invasion, but from internal collapse. In that year, the Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered by his own troops on campaign in Germania. This was not unprecedented. Several emperors had been assassinated by soldiers or praetorian guards. What made this different was what followed. For the next 50 years, the empire convulsed through a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. During this half-century, over 25 men claimed the imperial throne. Most ruled for less than 3 years. Most died violently, murdered by their own soldiers, killed in battle, executed by rivals. The crisis began almost casually, like a crack appearing in a seemingly solid wall. Maximinus Thrax, the soldier who murdered Alexander Severus, was proclaimed emperor by the Rhine legions. He was the first emperor to have risen entirely from the ranks, never having served in the Senate, a giant of a man from a Thracian peasant background who represented a new type of leader, military strongmen whose only legitimacy came from their soldiers' swords. The Senate, horrified at having a semi-barbarian peasant as emperor, declared him a public enemy and elevated 2 senators to the purple. Maximinus marched on Italy. The resulting civil war devastated the northern provinces. Cities that had been prosperous centers of trade became battlefields. Agriculture was disrupted as armies seized crops and conscripted farmers. The Rhine frontier, temporarily undefended, was breached by Germanic raiders. And this was only the beginning. Maximinus was killed by his own troops in 238 CE after ruling just 3 years. That same year saw 6 different emperors, a historical period literally called the Year of the 6 Emperors. The empire was consuming itself. The crisis was not merely political. Multiple armies, each backing different claimants, fought each other across the empire. Provinces were devastated by civil war. The Rhine and Danube frontiers, temporarily undefended, were breached by Germanic tribes who raided deep into Gaul and the Balkans. In the east, the newly resurgent Sassanid Persian Empire inflicted a humiliation that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. In 260 CE, they captured the Emperor Valerian in battle, a Roman emperor taken prisoner by foreigners for the first time in history. The capture of Valerian was recorded in Persian sources with triumphant detail. King Shapur I had a rock relief carved at Nakshi Rustam, showing Valerian kneeling before him in submission. Roman sources claim Valerian was used as a footstool when Shapur mounted his horse, and that after his death, his skin was tanned and displayed in a Persian temple. Whether literally true or propagandistic exaggeration, the psychological impact on Roman prestige was devastating. The emperor, the living embodiment of Roman power, had been humiliated, captured, displayed as a trophy. Economic collapse accompanied military chaos. The imperial government, desperate for funds to pay armies, began debasing the silver currency. The denarius, which had been 90% silver under Augustus, fell to less than 5% silver by 270 CE. Inflation exploded. Prices increased approximately 1,000% during the crisis. Trade networks, dependent on currency stability and security, began to fail. The monetary collapse destroyed the middle class. Merchants who had accumulated wealth in silver coins watched that wealth evaporate as the currency debased. Inflation made long-term contracts meaningless. A price agreed upon today might be worthless in 6 months. The sophisticated credit networks that had facilitated Mediterranean trade broke down. Merchants reverted to barter or demanded payment in gold, but gold was scarce, hoarded by those wealthy enough to possess it. Provincial cities, which had flourished during the 2nd century prosperity, found their tax burdens increasing even as their economic productivity collapsed. Urban populations declined as people fled to the countryside where they might survive through subsistence farming. The civic institutions that had characterized Roman urban life, the games, the public baths, the religious festivals, became unaffordable. Inscriptions recording public benefactions by wealthy citizens, common in the 1st and 2nd centuries, become rare in the 3rd century. The civic elite who had funded public life were either ruined by inflation or unwilling to invest in collapsing communities. Then came the plague. Starting around 250 CE and recurring in waves through the 270s, what historians call the Plague of Cyprian devastated the empire. Ancient sources claim that at its peak, 5,000 people per day were dying in the city of Rome alone. Modern historians are skeptical of such precise figures, but the demographic impact is undeniable. Population declined sharply. Agricultural labor became scarce. Tax revenues plummeted. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, for whom the plague is named, left a vivid description. The intestines, relaxed into a constant flux, discharged the bodily strength. A fire originated in the marrow ferments into wounds of the throat. The bowels waste with continual vomiting. The eyes are on fire with the injected blood. In some cases, the feet or some parts of the limbs are taken off by the infection of diseased putrefaction. So this was probably a hemorrhagic fever, possibly smallpox, though the exact pathogen remains unknown. What is certain is that it struck a population with no immunity, spreading through the dense urban environments that Roman civilization had created. The interconnected trade networks that had been Rome's economic strength became vectors for disease transmission. A plague beginning in Ethiopia or Egypt could reach Rome in weeks and from Rome spread throughout the empire in months. The plague's effects extended beyond immediate mortality. Villages lost so many inhabitants that they were abandoned entirely. Agricultural land reverted to wilderness for lack of farmers to work it. Military recruitment became impossible in plague-devastated regions. The army, already stretched thin across multiple frontiers, found its manpower dwindling precisely when it faced the most threats. By 270 CE, the empire appeared to be disintegrating entirely. The northwestern provinces, Germania, Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania, had broken away into a separate Gallic empire under their own line of emperors. In the east, the city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia had carved out another breakaway state controlling Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor. The legitimate emperor in Rome controlled only Italy and parts of the Balkans. The Gallic Empire was not a barbarian invasion, but a Roman secession. The provinces of Gaul, facing constant Germanic raids across a Rhine frontier that the central government could no longer defend, effectively declared independence under their own emperors. For 15 years, from 260 to 274 CE, the Gallic Empire functioned as a separate Roman state, maintaining Roman administration, law, and culture, but defending itself when Rome could not. Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire was even more remarkable. Palmyra had been a trading city in the Syrian desert, growing wealthy from the caravan trade between Rome and Persia. When Rome's eastern defences collapsed, Palmyra's ruler, Odenathus, became the de facto defender of the eastern provinces. After his assassination, his widow, Zenobia, expanded Palmyrene control over Egypt and Asia Minor, creating an Eastern empire that styled itself as Rome's successor. Zenobia claimed descent from Cleopatra, presented herself as a philosophical queen in the Hellenistic tradition, and ruled over Rome's wealthiest provinces. This was the nadir. If Rome had a single moment when collapse seemed inevitable, this was it. The empire had fractured into 3 pieces. The currency was worthless. Plague ravaged the population. Germanic tribes raided at will. Persia threatened from the east. Every institution that had held the empire together, the legions, the currency, the administration, the emperor's authority, had failed or was failing. What saved the empire was a series of soldier emperors from the Balkan provinces, tough, competent, ruthless military men who spent their entire reigns on campaign. Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, Probus. They reunited the breakaway territories through force. They fortified the frontiers. They attempted to restore the currency, though with limited success. By 284 CE, when Diocletian seized power, the immediate crisis had passed. Aurelian, ruling from 270 to 275 CE, was the most effective of these military emperors. He defeated the Goths in the Balkans, reconquered the Palmyrene Empire in a brilliant eastern campaign that saw Zenobia captured and displayed in Aurelian's triumph, then turned west and reintegrated the Gallic Empire through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic concessions. He built massive new walls around Rome itself, an admission that the city was no longer safe behind the shield of distant frontiers. He attempted currency reform, though with limited success against the entrenched inflation. He earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Yet even Aurelian was assassinated by his own officers in 275 CE, victim of the same military instability he had fought to overcome. The pattern was clear. Soldier emperors could win military victories, but they could not solve the underlying structural problems that had caused the crisis in the first place. But the empire that emerged from the crisis of the 3rd century was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The illusion of invincibility had shattered. The population had declined by perhaps a quarter. The economy had contracted dramatically. Most ominously, the solutions implemented to save the empire contained seeds of future catastrophe. Diocletian was a brilliant administrator faced with an impossible problem. The empire was too large and complex to be governed by a single person from a single city, especially given the constant military threats on multiple frontiers. His solution was systematic division. He split the empire administratively into 4 quarters, each governed by an emperor or Caesar. He massively expanded the bureaucracy to improve tax collection and administration. He attempted to freeze the economy in place with price and wage controls. He demanded that peasants remain tied to their land to ensure agricultural production and tax revenue. Diocletian's price edict of 301 CE was one of history's most ambitious attempts at economic central planning. It listed maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat and wine to clothing and haircuts. Violations were punishable by death. The edict survives in fragments inscribed on stone throughout the empire, a testament to the administrative reach of Roman government even in decline. It also failed completely. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at the mandated prices, creating shortages. The black market flourished. Within a few years, the edict was abandoned, though the inflationary pressures it had tried to contain remained. The Tetrarchy, ruled by 4 emperors, was Diocletian's most innovative solution. 2 senior emperors, Augusti, would rule the east and west, each assisted by a junior emperor, Caesar, who would be his designated successor. This would ensure stable succession, prevent civil wars, and allow each ruler to focus on his portion of the empire. It was a rational system designed by one of Rome's most capable administrators. It lasted barely 20 years. After Diocletian's abdication in 305 CE, he was the only Roman emperor to voluntarily retire, spending his final years growing cabbages in his palace at Split. The Tetrarchy collapsed into another round of civil wars. The problem was fundamental. Rome's political culture had no mechanism for managing shared authority. The imperial office was, by definition, supreme. Having 4 men claiming varying degrees of supremacy created ambiguity that could only be resolved through violence. These reforms stabilized the empire in the short term, but they also created new structural problems. The enlarged bureaucracy was staggeringly expensive, consuming resources that might have gone to military defense. The division of authority, intended to improve governance, instead created new opportunities for civil war whenever the tetrarchs disagreed. The binding of peasants to the land began the transformation of the free Roman peasantry into a semi-servile class, the beginning of feudalism. Most significantly, Diocletian's reforms revealed a brutal truth: the empire could no longer defend itself with citizen armies. The crisis of the 3rd century had demonstrated that Roman citizens were increasingly unwilling to serve in the legions. Civil wars had decimated the professional military class. The frontiers were too long, the threats too numerous. The solution, developed gradually over the 4th century, was to recruit soldiers from among the very Germanic tribes the army was supposed to be defending against. The Romans called this arrangement foederati, federates. Germanic tribes would be settled within or near the empire's borders. In exchange for land and payment, they would provide warriors to defend Roman frontiers. This was not necessarily foolish. The foederati system worked after a fashion for almost a century. Germanic warriors were effective soldiers. Many were genuinely loyal to Rome, or at least to the Roman commanders who paid them. The problem was that it transferred military power out of Roman hands. The empire's survival now depended on the goodwill of peoples who had every reason to take what they wanted if Roman control weakened further. The logic was seductive and dangerous. Germanic warriors were available, effective, and relatively cheap. They would accept land and limited payment rather than the higher salaries demanded by Roman recruits. For cash-strapped emperors facing immediate military threats, hiring Germanic federates was a rational short-term solution. The long-term consequence, creating armed groups inside the empire who owed loyalty to their own chiefs rather than to Rome, seemed less urgent than the immediate crisis of frontier defense. In 312 CE, Constantine defeated his rivals and reunited the empire under a single ruler. He made 2 decisions that would shape the rest of Roman history. First, he legalized Christianity, beginning its transformation from persecuted sect to state religion. Second, he founded a new capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. Constantine's conversion to Christianity remains one of history's most consequential religious changes. Whether motivated by genuine spiritual conviction or political calculation, contemporary sources offer both interpretations. The effect was to align Roman imperial power with the growing Christian community. Christianity had grown from a small Jewish sect to perhaps 10% of the empire's population by 312 CE, despite periodic persecutions. It was particularly strong in urban areas and among certain social classes. Constantine's conversion made Christianity fashionable, politically advantageous, and eventually mandatory. The cultural transformation was profound. Temples that had stood for centuries were gradually abandoned or converted to churches. The Olympic Games, held since 776 BCE, were ended by Christian emperors who considered them pagan. Traditional Roman religious festivals were suppressed. The calendar was Christianized. Sunday became a day of rest. Christian feast days replaced traditional holidays. Classical literature, considered pagan, became suspect. Libraries accumulated in temples were dispersed or destroyed. The classical world was being deliberately dismantled by its own successors. Constantinople was strategically positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, with access to both Mediterranean and Black Sea trade routes. Its fortifications were formidable, walls that would prove impregnable for over 1,000 years. Most importantly, it was far from the Rhine and Danube frontiers where the military threats were most acute. An emperor in Constantinople could respond more quickly to crises in the Balkans or the eastern frontier. This shift eastward, though strategically sound, signaled a reality that would become explicit by the end of the 4th century. The western provinces were becoming indefensible liabilities. The east was wealthier, more urbanized, easier to defend. Constantinople's rise would eventually come at the expense of Rome itself. Constantine died in 337 CE, having successfully reunited the empire and established a new dynasty. For a brief period, it seemed Rome had stabilized. The economy showed signs of recovery. The frontiers held. Christianity was becoming a unifying cultural force. Then came the moment that revealed how fragile this stability actually was. In the winter of 376 CE, a large group of Goths, perhaps tens of thousands, appeared at the Danube frontier, requesting asylum within the empire. They were fleeing westward, driven by a new terror emerging from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. The Huns were unlike anything the Romans had encountered before. They were mounted nomads from deep in Asia, superb horsemen and archers, practicing a kind of mobile warfare that could strike and vanish before slower Roman infantry could respond. Germanic tribes that had troubled Rome's frontiers for centuries were themselves fleeing in terror from Hunnic raids. Roman sources describe the Huns in terms dripping with cultural prejudice and genuine fear. Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that they were so prodigiously ugly and bent that they might be two-legged animals, as this was xenophobic exaggeration, but it reflected genuine Roman bewilderment at encountering a culture utterly unlike their own. The Huns lived their entire lives on horseback, eating, sleeping, conducting meetings while mounted. They were masters of the composite bow, which could pierce Roman armor at distances Roman infantry could not match. Their tactics of feigned retreat and encirclement had no counter in Roman military doctrine, which was based on forming solid infantry lines. Most terrifying was their unpredictability. Germanic tribes, for all their military threat, were known quantities. Romans had fought Germans for centuries, understood their social structures, traded with them, recruited from them. The Huns were alien, distant steppe nomads suddenly appearing on the empire's doorstep, practicing a form of warfare Rome had no experience countering. The Gothic refugees at the Danube included men, women, and children, entire tribes seeking sanctuary. The Roman authorities faced a choice. They could refuse entry and fight a defensive war against desperate peoples with nowhere else to go. Or they could admit them, settle them in Thrace, and integrate them into the empire as federati. The Emperor Valens, ruling the eastern half of the empire from Constantinople, decided to admit them. This was not an obviously insane decision. Rome had been absorbing and Romanizing barbarian peoples for centuries. The Goths were already partially Christianized. Many had served in Roman armies. With proper management, they could become farmers and soldiers contributing to the empire's defense. Valens's councillors presented it as an opportunity. A report to the emperor, recorded by Ammianus, praised the decision. A wonderful opportunity had presented itself for providing the emperor with a great army of recruits from the ends of the earth. The Goths would farm lands depopulated by plague and war. They would provide warriors to defend the Danube frontier. They would pay taxes. The empire would gain population and military strength without conquest. What went wrong was the management. Roman officials responsible for settling the Gothic refugees were staggeringly corrupt. They were supposed to provide food and supplies to the refugees during their settlement. Instead, they sold supplies at inflated prices or withheld them entirely, extracting bribes and selling Gothic children into slavery in exchange for scraps of food. Lupicinus, the Roman military commander in Thrace, and his subordinate Maximus conducted the resettlement with such spectacular corruption that it shocked even by the standards of late Roman administration. They sold dog meat to starving Goths at inflated prices. They demanded Gothic children as slaves in exchange for grain. They systematically stripped the refugees of whatever possessions they had managed to bring across the Danube. They created conditions calculated to provoke the exact disaster they were supposed to prevent. The Goths, starving and abused, rebelled, and Rome discovered that it had admitted an entire warrior people into the heart of the empire. The rebellion began with a feast. Lupicinus, hoping to neutralize Gothic leadership, invited the Gothic chiefs Fritigern and Alavivus to a banquet in the city of Marcianople. While the chiefs dined, Lupicinus's men attempted to massacre their bodyguards waiting outside. The plan failed. Fritigern fought his way out, and the Goths had their provocation. Within days, the entire Gothic population was in arms. Valens marched north from Constantinople with the field army of the east to crush the rebellion. He was confident. Despite everything, Romans still believed that in open battle their legions were invincible. This was the assumption that had held for 8 centuries. Germanic tribes might raid and plunder, but in a pitched battle, Roman discipline and equipment always prevailed. On August 9th, 378 CE, near the city of Adrianople, Emperor Valens engaged the Gothic army commanded by the chieftain Fritigern. The details of the battle are preserved in the chronicle of Ammianus Marcellinus, a soldier who had served under earlier emperors. The morning of the battle was scorching hot. The Roman army, perhaps 20 to 30,000 strong, had marched since dawn without adequate water. They arrived at the Gothic position, a wagon circle on high ground, exhausted and dehydrated. The Goths had formed their camp in a defensive circle of wagons, a traditional Germanic fortification. Gothic cavalry, which had been foraging for supplies, was absent. Fritigern sent emissaries requesting negotiation. He was buying time, waiting for his cavalry to return. Some of Valens's officers recognized this and urged caution. They should wait for reinforcements. The Western Emperor Gratian was marching to join them with additional legions. They should rest the troops, bring up supplies, engage from a position of strength. But Valens was impatient. Gratian, his nephew and co-emperor, had recently won victories against Germanic tribes on the Rhine frontier. Valens, jealous of Gratian's military reputation, wanted victory before reinforcements arrived. He wanted the glory of crushing the rebellion alone. Pride, the fatal pride that assumes past success, guarantees future victory, dictated his decision. The battle began badly for the Romans. Valens, impatient for glory and unwilling to wait for reinforcements marching from the west, attacked the Gothic wagon circle without proper reconnaissance. The Gothic cavalry, which had been foraging, returned mid-battle and struck the Roman flank. The Roman left wing collapsed. The infantry, packed too tightly to maneuver, was surrounded. The Gothic cavalry attack was devastating precisely because it was unexpected. Roman scouts had failed to locate the Gothic horsemen. When they appeared, perhaps 10,000 mounted warriors, they struck the Roman flank in a coordinated charge. The Roman cavalry, outnumbered and surprised, broke and fled. This exposed the infantry's flanks. Roman infantry doctrine depended on maintaining formation. Legionaries fought in organized units, each man protected by his neighbor's shield. The formation presenting an impenetrable wall of shields and spears, but this required space and organization. The Roman troops, pressed together in the summer heat, could not maneuver. As the Gothic cavalry encircled them, the formation compressed. Men could not lift their shields or swing their weapons. The organized military machine became a panicked mob. What followed was slaughter. The Roman army was annihilated. Perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 soldiers died. Modern historians debate the exact figures, but all agree the casualties were catastrophic. Valens himself was killed, though his body was never recovered. Some accounts claim he died in a burning farmhouse where he had taken refuge. The Romans lost not just an emperor, but an entire field army, a third of the Eastern Empire's mobile forces. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing a decade later, compared Adrianople to Cannae, the catastrophic defeat inflicted on Rome by Hannibal in 216 BCE. The comparison was apt. Both battles saw Roman armies encircled and destroyed by mobile forces using tactics Roman infantry doctrine could not counter. Both demonstrated that Roman military dominance was not inevitable, but contingent on facing enemies whose tactics the Roman system could handle. The psychological impact was perhaps greater than the material loss. Roman invincibility, already questioned during the 3rd century crisis, had now been definitively shattered. A Germanic people, recently refugees begging for admission, had destroyed a Roman emperor and his army in open battle. More ominously, the Goths remained within the empire. They could not be expelled. The Romans no longer had sufficient military force to destroy them. The new Eastern Emperor, Theodosius I, had no choice but to negotiate. In 382 CE, the Goths were given land in Thrace and allowed to retain their own leaders and military structure. They became foederati, supposedly serving Rome, but in practice remaining a semi-independent military force inside imperial territory. This established a precedent that would be repeated with catastrophic frequency over the next century. Roman military weakness forced acceptance of Germanic peoples settling within the empire as autonomous groups. Each such settlement reduced Roman control and military capacity further, creating a spiral of decline. Theodosius I died in 395 CE, and in his will he divided the empire between his two sons. Arcadius received the east, Honorius the west. This division, initially administrative, became permanent. The Roman Empire was now two empires with separate administrations, separate armies, often competing interests. The eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, was wealthier and more defensible. Its heartland, Greece, Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, had been urbanized for over a millennium. Its trade routes connected to the Silk Roads of Asia. Its capital had impregnable fortifications. Most importantly, its frontiers were shorter and easier to defend than the sprawling western boundaries. The western half was poorer, more rural, and faced longer, more vulnerable frontiers. The wealthy city of Rome itself was declining in importance. Emperors now ruled from Ravenna in northern Italy, protected by surrounding marshes. The western provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, North Africa, were vital economically but increasingly difficult to defend. The transfer of the imperial capital from Rome to Ravenna symbolized the West's desperation. Ravenna was not historically significant, culturally important, or strategically located except in one crucial respect. It was surrounded by marshes that made it nearly impossible to besiege. The emperor could hide there, safe from armies that could range freely through the rest of Italy. This was defensive thinking, the mentality of a regime that had given up on projecting power and now sought merely to survive. This division guaranteed that when crisis came, the East would prioritize its own survival over aiding the West. The man who would defend the West during its first great crisis was named Stilicho. He was half Vandal by birth, the son of a barbarian cavalry officer who had risen in Roman service. Stilicho himself had climbed the ranks through military competence to become Magister Militum, supreme military commander, under Theodosius the Fenced. When Theodosius died, he effectively became regent for the young Western Emperor Honorius. Stilicho was Rome's last great general in the classical mold, a strategist who understood logistics, fortifications, and how to manage the empire's desperately limited military resources. He also understood, better than most Romans, the peoples Rome was now fighting. He spoke Gothic. He had fought alongside Germanic federates. He knew they were neither mindless barbarians nor invincible warriors, but peoples with their own political calculations and military capabilities. His marriage connected him to the imperial family. He had married Serena, Theodosius's niece, an adopted daughter. His own daughter Maria was married to the emperor Honorius, making Stilicho the emperor's father-in-law and regent. He stood at the apex of Western Roman power, yet he remained always aware that many Romans viewed him with suspicion because of his barbarian ancestry. This positioned him uniquely, connected to both Roman and Germanic worlds, yet fully belonging to neither. The threat Stilicho faced was named Alaric. He was a Gothic leader, not a king in the Germanic sense, but a war chieftain who had risen to prominence after Adrianople. Alaric had served in the Roman army as a federati commander. He understood Roman military organization from the inside, and he wanted what many Romanized Germanic leaders wanted: an official position within the empire, land for his people, regular payment, recognition. What Alaric did not want, initially, was to destroy Rome. He wanted to be incorporated into it. This is crucial to understanding the next decade of Roman-Gothic relations. Alaric was not Attila the Hun seeking to burn civilization. He was more like a labor union leader negotiating with management, except his union was an army, and his negotiating tactic was invasion. He wanted what the Visigoths settled in Thrace had received: land, payment, recognition as legitimate members of the Roman system. He spent a decade trying to force Rome to give him these things. For over a decade, from 395 to 408 CE, Alaric maneuvered through the Balkans, threatening Constantinople, and then moving into Italy, demanding recognition and payment, withdrawing when Stilicho's armies blocked him. These were not straightforward military campaigns, but complex negotiations conducted through the medium of military positioning. In 401 CE, Alaric invaded Italy for the first time. He moved his entire people, warriors, families, possessions, across the Alps into the Po Valley. This was not a raid, but a migration. Alaric was forcing the issue, demanding that Rome either fight him or come to terms. Stilicho defeated Alaric twice in Italy, at Pollentia in 402 CE and Verona in 403 CE, but he could not destroy him. Rome no longer had the military strength to annihilate an entire Gothic army. Each victory ended with negotiation, with Alaric withdrawing in exchange for promises of land or payment. The Battle of Pollentia was a strange, inconclusive affair. Fought on Easter Sunday in 402 CE, it began when Stilicho's forces surprised the Gothic camp during Christian religious observances, both sides being Christian, though of different sects. The Goths, caught unprepared, nevertheless fought the Romans to a standstill. Stilicho captured Alaric's family and baggage train, but not Alaric himself. The Goths withdrew but remained intact as a fighting force. After Pollentia, Stilicho could have pressed the attack, but he chose negotiation. He returned Alaric's family. He offered payments and the possibility of settlement. This was not weakness, it was strategic realism. Destroying the Goths would require committing forces that Stilicho needed elsewhere. Better to reach a settlement that converted Alaric from threat to ally, his warriors from enemies to federates. But the Roman court in Ravenna, isolated from reality, saw only that Stilicho had let the Goths escape. Whispers of treason began. The fundamental problem was that Rome was fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. While Stilicho dealt with Alaric in Italy, other Germanic peoples were pressing the Rhine frontier in Gaul. The Sassanid Persians threatened the eastern provinces. Britain was being raided by Picts and Saxons. The empire lacked sufficient forces to defend everywhere simultaneously. On the last day of December 406 CE, the Rhine frontier collapsed. A coalition of Germanic peoples, Vandals, Alans, Suebi, crossed the frozen river into Gaul en masse. The Rhine, which had been the empire's northern boundary for 4 centuries, was breached. Within 3 years, these peoples would devastate Gaul and cross into Hispania, effectively removing both provinces from imperial control. The crossing of the Rhine was an invasion, but it was also a desperate migration. These Germanic peoples were themselves fleeing pressure from the Huns, pushing westward from the steppes. They crossed into Gaul not as conquerors with a strategic plan, but as refugees seeking safety, willing to fight their way to survival. That the Rhine froze solid enough to support a mass crossing, a rare meteorological event, seemed to contemporaries like divine judgment on Rome. For 3 years, the invaders devastated Gaul. They were not a single unified force, but multiple groups with different objectives, often fighting each other as much as they fought Romans. The Vandals and Alans pushed westward toward the Atlantic. The Suebi occupied the northwest. Roman authority collapsed outside fortified cities. The countryside became a battleground where survival trumped law. Contemporary accounts describe Gallic cities barricaded against the invaders, watching smoke rise from burning villas, receiving refugees with tales of massacres. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, listed the peoples involved with the horror of a man watching his world torn apart. Quadi, Vandals, Sarmatians, Alans, Gepids, Herules, Saxons, Burgundians, Alemanni, oh, wretched empire, have devastated everything. Stilicho in Italy could do nothing. He lacked the troops to defend both Italy and Gaul. His critics at the imperial court in Ravenna began whispering that he was incompetent, possibly treasonous, perhaps conspiring with Alaric to divide the empire. The conspiracy theories fed on Stilicho's barbarian ancestry and his policy of negotiation with Germanic leaders. To Roman senators who remembered when Rome dictated terms to barbarians rather than negotiating with them, Stilicho's diplomacy looked like collusion. That he spoke Gothic, that he had married his daughter to Honorius, that he treated Germanic leaders as negotiating partners rather than enemies, all this became evidence of treason in the minds of his enemies. In August 408 CE, a riot erupted in the army garrison at Pavia. Soldiers massacred the families of Gothic federates serving in the Roman army, women, children, slaughtered by their own comrades. It was a calculated provocation. The Gothic federates immediately defected to Alaric, strengthening his army by perhaps 30,000 warriors. Someone had deliberately sabotaged Rome's defences. In the chaos following the Pavia massacre, Stilicho's enemies moved. The emperor Honorius, weak, paranoid, and manipulated by his courtiers, ordered Stilicho's arrest and execution on charges of treason. Stilicho, who might have resisted with the soldiers loyal to him, chose not to plunge Italy into civil war. He sought sanctuary in a church in Ravenna. He was dragged out and beheaded. The execution of Stilicho was one of history's great acts of self-destructive stupidity. The only general capable of coordinating the Western Empire's defense was murdered by the emperor he served on charges that were obviously false in the midst of multiple military crises. Honorius had cut off his right hand with his left, as a contemporary observed. With Stilicho dead, there was no one to manage Alaric. There was no one capable of coordinating the defense of multiple frontiers. There was no one who understood that Rome's survival depended on sophisticated diplomacy backed by limited military force. Alaric, whose negotiations with Stilicho had been progressing toward some kind of settlement, now faced a Roman government that refused to recognize him, refused to pay him, refused to grant his people land. The new regime in Ravenna treated him not as a negotiating partner, but as a bandit to be ignored or destroyed. Alaric responded to the only logic remaining to him. He marched on Rome. In 408 CE, he besieged the city. Rome had not been besieged by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The population, perhaps still numbering close to 1 million, faced starvation. The Senate negotiated, paid enormous ransoms in gold and silver, promised recognition. Alaric withdrew. The siege revealed how utterly dependent Rome had become on imports. The city no longer produced enough food to feed itself. Egyptian grain had once filled Rome's granaries, but Egypt was now controlled by the Eastern Empire, which was not sharing. North African grain was unreliable, with Vandals disrupting the trade routes. With Alaric's Goths blocking the roads into Italy, the city's vast population was trapped in a deadly logistical puzzle. The Senate, meeting in emergency session, debated how much gold to offer. Some senators argued for resistance, for marshalling the city's resources for defense. Others pointed out that the city had no army, the legions were elsewhere, dead at Pollentia, or deployed on other frontiers. The Senate represented wealth, tradition, and political authority, but it had no military power. They were politicians trying to negotiate with warriors, and the warriors knew it. The ransom Rome paid to lift the first siege was staggering: 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet-dyed skins, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. The Senate stripped gold from statues to meet the demand. Wealthy citizens were taxed at punitive rates. The city's accumulated wealth was transferred to Alaric's Goths to purchase a temporary reprieve, but the promises were not kept. The imperial court in Ravenna, safe behind its marshes, refused to ratify any agreement. Honorius, advised by courtiers who had no understanding of military reality, insisted that the Emperor of Rome could not be dictated to by barbarians. The Senate's agreements were repudiated. The gold Rome had paid bought nothing permanent. Alaric besieged Rome twice more in 409 and 410 CE. The second siege saw him attempt to negotiate by elevating his own puppet emperor, a Roman senator named Priscus Attalus, in opposition to Honorius. This was Alaric attempting to work within the Roman system to create a legitimate emperor who would grant him what he wanted. But Attalus proved useless, unable to command loyalty or resources. Alaric deposed his own puppet in frustration. Finally, on August 24, 410 CE, his Gothic soldiers entered the city. Sources disagree on whether they were admitted by sympathetic slaves who opened the gates, or whether the Goths breached the Salarian gate through force. The distinction hardly mattered. Rome was open to foreign soldiers for the first time in 8 centuries. The sack of Rome lasted 3 days. Alaric, a Christian, had ordered his men to respect churches and clergy. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was a relatively restrained sack. But it was still a sack: looting, violence, destruction. The city that had conquered the world was humiliated. Gothic soldiers moved through Rome with the casual efficiency of men who knew their work. They did not burn the city systematically. This was not about destruction, but extraction of wealth. They looted the great houses of the senatorial aristocracy, stripping them of gold, silver, jewelry, fine textiles. They took captives for ransom. They raided temples and churches despite Alaric's orders, though major basilicas were generally spared. The Basilica of St. Peter saw refugees crowding inside, gambling that Gothic Christianity would protect sacred space. Some accounts record individual acts of restraint that highlight the strange hybrid nature of the Goths: barbarians who were also Christians, outsiders who nevertheless respected elements of Roman culture. One Gothic warrior searching a church encountered a consecrated virgin guarding sacred vessels. When she explained what they were, he reportedly escorted her and the vessels safely to a church, his respect for Christian holiness overriding his interest in plunder. But other accounts tell of senators murdered in their own atriums, of women raped, of slaves finally having opportunity to take revenge on cruel masters, of days of chaos where social order dissolved and violence erupted in forms that had been suppressed for centuries of Roman law. The psychological shock reverberated across the empire and beyond. In Bethlehem, St. Jerome wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." In North Africa, St. Augustine began writing The City of God, a theological response to pagans who claimed that abandoning the old gods had led to Rome's fall. The question posed by Augustine's pagan opponents cut deep. Why had Rome fallen after it became Christian? For 3 centuries, Christians had claimed their god was more powerful than Rome's traditional deities. They had argued that Rome would flourish under Christian rule. Now the city had been sacked for the first time since before Christianity existed. Was this not evidence that the old gods had protected Rome, that Christian intolerance toward traditional religion had brought divine punishment? Augustine's answer, that earthly cities rise and fall, but the city of God is eternal, was a profound theological reframing. But it was also an admission that Christianity could not guarantee Rome's survival. The faith that was supposed to protect the empire was now explaining its fall. Yet here is the remarkable thing. Alaric left after 3 days. He had not come to destroy Rome. He had come to force Rome to negotiate. After sacking the city, he marched south toward North Africa, perhaps intending to seize the grain-producing provinces. But he died of fever in southern Italy that same year. His Goths, now led by his brother-in-law Atholf, eventually moved into Gaul and Hispania, where they established a Visigothic kingdom that would endure for 3 centuries. Alaric's death was as anticlimactic as his career had been frustrating. After a decade of marching armies through the Balkans and Italy, after sacking the Eternal City, he died of illness, probably malaria, near Cosenza in southern Italy. Gothic legend claimed his followers diverted a river, buried Alaric in the riverbed with his treasure, then restored the river's course so his grave could never be found or plundered. Whether literally true or not, the story captured Alaric's ambiguous legacy. Neither quite Roman nor fully barbarian, neither conqueror nor loyal federate, a man who wanted recognition from Rome, but whose greatest fame came from being the first foreign leader in 800 years to sack Rome itself. Rome endured, the city survived the sack, the empire survived Alaric's death, the Senate continued to meet. Bishops continued to administer their dioceses, daily life resumed, but something fundamental had broken. The sack of 410 CE had demonstrated that Rome was no longer protected by military invincibility or divine favor. The unthinkable had happened. If it could happen once, it could happen again. The Western Empire limped forward. Britain was effectively abandoned. In 410 CE, the same year as the sack, the Emperor Honorius sent letters to the cities of Britain telling them to see to their own defense. The province had been Roman for over 3 centuries. Now it was cut loose, left to face Saxon raiders alone. The letter to the Britons is one of history's most coldly bureaucratic abandonments. Look to your own defences. Rescript of Honorius to the cities of Britain. No explanation, no promise of future aid, just the administrative notification that Britain was no longer part of the imperial defence network. 3.5 centuries of Roman rule ended with a memo. Britain's fall into post-Roman chaos was swift and nearly complete. Without the legions, without Roman administration, without the economic integration of empire, Roman Britain simply dissolved. Some cities maintained walls and some level of organization for decades, but the villa economy collapsed. Trade with the continent ceased. Urban populations fled to the countryside or to fortified hilltops. Germanic invaders, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, arrived not as a single conquest, but as generations of raiding, trading, and settling. Celtic Britons retreated westward into Wales and Cornwall. Within a century, Roman Britain had become Anglo-Saxon England, and Latin had been replaced by Germanic languages. Of all Rome's provinces, Britain experienced the most complete civilizational collapse. Gaul was being divided among Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths under Atholf settled in Aquitaine, the Burgundians occupied the Rhone Valley, the Franks expanded in the north. These peoples were nominally Roman foederati, theoretically defending Roman interests. In practice, they were creating independent kingdoms on what had been Roman territory. Honorius died in 423 CE without an heir. After 2 years of confusion and civil war, a compromise candidate emerged. Valentinian III, a 6-year-old boy controlled by his mother, Galla Placidia. Real power lay with a general named Flavius Aetius. Aetius was the last great Roman general. Like Stilicho, he had grown up among Germanic peoples. He had spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns and had learned their language and customs. He understood that Rome could no longer dominate through military force alone. Survival required diplomacy, playing Germanic kingdoms against each other, maintaining a balance of power. Aetius's career was built on his Hunnic connections. He had lived among the Huns as a diplomatic hostage in his youth, learning their language, customs, and way of war. He understood the steppe peoples as few Romans did. More importantly, he had personal relationships with Hunnic leaders who remembered him from his time among them. When Aetius needed military force to secure his position in the endless power struggles of the Western court, he hired Hunnic mercenaries. His power base was not the Roman legions, but Hunnic cavalry paid with gold extracted from the shrinking western provinces. For 2 decades, Aetius managed the impossible. He defeated rival claimants to imperial authority. He maintained some level of Roman control in Gaul by playing Visigoths against Burgundians against Franks. He taxed what remained of Roman Gaul to pay for his field army, which consisted primarily of Hunnic mercenaries. His method was ruthless pragmatism. When the Visigoths in Aquitaine grew too powerful, he allied with the Burgundians and Huns to contain them. When the Burgundians threatened to expand, he massacred them with Hunnic cavalry and resettled the survivors in reduced territory. When Gallic peasants rebelled against crushing taxation, the revolt of the Bagaudai, desperate farmers driven to banditry by Roman and Germanic oppression alike, Aetius suppressed them with whatever forces were available. He was not defending Roman civilization in any idealistic sense. He was maintaining a balance of power that allowed the Western Empire's shell to persist a few decades longer. Then, in 429 CE, catastrophe struck from an unexpected direction. Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, led his entire people, perhaps 80,000 men, women, and children, across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. The richest provinces of the Western Empire lay open before him. Roman North Africa, modern Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, was the economic heartland of the West. It produced the grain that fed Rome. It generated perhaps 40% of the Western Empire's tax revenue. The coastal cities were wealthy, urbanized, and defended by minimal military forces. The North African provinces had been Roman for 6 centuries, since the destruction of Carthage in the Punic Wars. They were among the most Romanized territories outside Italy. Carthage, rebuilt as a Roman city, was the second city of the West, rivaling Rome itself in population and wealth. The region produced grain, olive oil, and wine on vast estates worked by slave labor and exported across the Mediterranean. North African bishops, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, had shaped Christian theology. This was not a peripheral frontier, but the economic heart of the Western Empire. and it had almost no military defences. The field armies were deployed in Gaul and Italy. The North African provinces relied on the Mediterranean Sea as their defence, assuming Roman naval power would prevent any invasion. That assumption was about to be fatally tested. Over the next decade, Gothic conquered the entire region. He moved systematically down the coast, besieging and capturing cities that had been Roman for centuries. Roman resistance was minimal. There were no legions to oppose him, no fleet to intercept his movements. Local militias and citizen levies could not stand against the Vandal warriors who had fought their way across Europe. In 439 CE, he captured Carthage, the greatest city of Roman Africa. The Vandals now controlled the western Mediterranean's most productive agricultural lands and possessed a naval fleet that could strike any coastal city from Hispania to Italy. The fall of Carthage was economically and symbolically devastating. Economically, Rome lost its grain supply. The city that had once been fed by Egyptian and African grain now faced chronic food shortages. The Western imperial government lost its primary revenue source, making it impossible to maintain even the reduced military forces still loyal to Ravenna. Symbolically, the loss of Carthage, the ancient enemy Rome had destroyed in 3 savage wars, represented a historical reversal of cosmic proportions. Carthage, obliterated by Rome, had risen again under Germanic rule while Rome declined. The loss of Africa was economically devastating. The Western imperial government lost its primary source of revenue. Rome's grain supply was cut off, forcing the population to rely on supplies from other provinces that were themselves barely under imperial control. The Western Empire was effectively bankrupt, but worse than the economic loss was the strategic consequence. Gothic now controlled a fleet. The Vandals, landlocked Germanic tribesmen for their entire history, had captured the Roman Mediterranean fleet at Carthage and learned to use it. They began raiding the coastline of Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, even Greece and the Balkans. No coastal city was safe. The Mediterranean, our sea for 6 centuries, was now controlled by barbarians. Aetius could do nothing. His forces were committed in Gaul. There was no fleet to contest Vandal naval dominance. The Eastern Emperor in Constantinople sent an expedition in 441 CE, but withdrew it prematurely to deal with Hunnic threats in the Balkans. The Eastern Empire's decision to abandon the African expedition revealed the permanent split between East and West. Constantinople still had the resources to challenge the Vandals, but it prioritized its own frontiers over aiding the West. The expedition was recalled not because it was failing, but because Eastern provinces faced threats. In the calculus of Eastern imperial policy, losing Western Africa was acceptable if it meant securing Eastern territory. The loss of Africa ensured that the Western Empire could not recover. Even if other provinces had been reconquered, the revenue base was gone. The empire could no longer afford to maintain the military forces necessary for its own defense. Then the Huns came. Attila became king of the Huns in 434 CE. He was a brilliant military leader and a sophisticated diplomatic strategist. He understood that the Roman Empire, divided and weakening, could be extorted for enormous payments in gold simply by threatening invasion. Attila was not the mindless barbarian of later legend. He conducted diplomacy with Roman envoys in multiple languages. He spoke Gothic and Latin in addition to Hunnic. He maintained a court that received ambassadors, conducted negotiations, and engaged in the complex protocol of interstate relations. He understood Roman politics, the division between East and West, the weakness of Western emperors, the wealth of Eastern provinces. He played Romans against each other with skill that would have suited a Roman senator. His strategy was extortion backed by military threat. He demanded tribute in exchange for peace, and when tribute was paid, he demanded more. The Eastern Empire paid him thousands of pounds of gold annually. When they tried to assassinate him through a treacherous embassy, he exposed the plot and demanded even higher payments. The Western Empire, poorer but equally vulnerable, paid what it could and hoped Attila would focus his attention eastward. For over a decade, Attila played east against west, threatening Constantinople one year and Ravenna the next, extracting tribute from both. The Eastern Empire paid him hundreds of pounds of gold annually to stay away from Constantinople's walls. The Western Empire had less to pay but provided auxiliary forces and diplomatic recognition. In 450 CE, Attila demanded something unprecedented: marriage to Honoria, sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, and with her, half the Western Empire as dowry. When this was refused, he invaded. The marriage demand had a bizarre origin. Honoria, the emperor's sister, had been forced into a celibate religious life after an affair with her chamberlain. In desperation or spite, she sent her ring to Attila with a letter asking for help. Attila interpreted this, or chose to interpret it, as a marriage proposal and demanded half the Western Empire as her dowry. When Valentinian refused, Attila had his pretext for invasion. Whether Attila genuinely believed he had a legal claim to half the empire or was simply using Honoria's letter as a diplomatic pretext is unknowable. What mattered was that he had constructed a justification for invasion that, in the twisted logic of late Roman politics, had some technical legitimacy. He was not invading as a barbarian, but as a suitor demanding his rightful bride and inheritance. Attila's army, perhaps 50,000 strong and including many Germanic peoples under Hunnic overlordship, crossed the Rhine and swept into Gaul. Cities were besieged, populations massacred. It appeared that what remained of Roman Gaul would be conquered by the Huns. The invasion was terrifying not just for its military threat, but for what it represented. The Huns embodied everything Romans feared about the world beyond civilization: nomadic peoples from distant steppes, practicing unfamiliar forms of warfare, uninterested in Roman culture or governance, seeking only plunder and dominance. If the Germanic peoples were at least Christian and somewhat Romanized, the Huns remained alien and terrifying. Orleans resisted a siege, buying time through desperate defense. The city's bishop, Annianus, became a local hero for organizing resistance, and, according to legend, seeing relief forces approaching from the city walls just as the gates were about to yield. Whether through divine intervention or fortunate timing, Orleans held long enough for Aetius to assemble a response. Aetius assembled the last great Roman coalition army. It consisted of his own Roman field army, Visigothic federates under King Theodoric, Burgundian and Frankish contingents, Alan cavalry. This was no longer a Roman army in the traditional sense, but a coalition of peoples who feared Hunnic domination more than they distrusted each other. In June 451 CE, Aetius met Attila's army at the Catalonian plains in central Gaul. The battle was catastrophic for both sides. Theodoric, the Visigothic king, was killed. Casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, but Attila withdrew, his aura of invincibility broken. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, also called the Battle of Chalons, may have been the largest clash of the post-Roman period. Sources claim hundreds of thousands of warriors engaged, though modern historians are skeptical of such numbers. What is certain is that it was a massive, brutal encounter between two coalition armies, neither purely Roman nor purely barbarian, fighting over the corpse of Roman Gaul. The battle's outcome was ambiguous. Attila withdrew, but his army was intact. He had not been destroyed, merely checked. But the psychological impact was significant. Attila's Huns could be stopped. They were not invincible. The coalition that Aetius had assembled, Romans, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, fighting together, demonstrated that cooperation among Rome's successors could achieve what Rome alone no longer could. He returned the next year, 452 CE, invading Italy directly. Aetius lacked the forces to stop him in open battle. The Huns swept through northern Italy, besieging cities, spreading terror. Rome itself appeared doomed. The invasion of Italy was even more devastating than the Gallic campaign. Northern Italian cities, Aquileia, Milan, Pavia, were besieged and sacked. Aquileia was destroyed so thoroughly that its survivors fled to lagoon islands in the Adriatic, founding settlements that would eventually become Venice. The Po Valley, Italy's agricultural heartland, was ravaged. Refugees fled south, spreading panic that the Huns were unstoppable. Then Attila withdrew. Ancient sources attribute this to a diplomatic mission by Pope Leo I, who supposedly convinced Attila to spare Rome. Modern historians suspect disease in Attila's army and disruption of his supply lines were more significant factors. Regardless, Attila retreated north and died the following year, apparently from a burst blood vessel on his wedding night to a young Gothic bride. The story of Leo I confronting Attila became a foundation myth for papal authority. According to legend, the Pope met Attila outside Rome and through divine intervention or force of personality, convinced the Hun to spare the city. A fresco by Raphael in the Vatican depicts the scene, showing Saints Peter and Paul appearing in the sky above Leo, their spiritual power reinforcing papal authority. Whether the meeting happened at all, and if so, what was actually discussed, is unknowable. But the story served a purpose. In a world where Roman emperors were powerless, the Pope had saved Rome. With Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire collapsed. The Germanic peoples under Hunnic domination rebelled and destroyed their former overlords. The Hunnic threat vanished as suddenly as it had emerged, but the reprieve came too late for Rome. The cost of the Hunnic Wars had finished what remained of the Western Empire's military capacity. And Aetius, the general who had held everything together for 20 years, was about to be destroyed by the very emperor he served. On September 20, 454 CE, Aetius was summoned to the imperial palace in Ravenna for an audience with Valentinian III. As Aetius presented a financial report, Valentinian rose from his throne, drew his sword, and personally murdered Aetius, shouting accusations of treason and conspiracy. The scene is preserved in multiple sources, each adding details that may be historical or legendary. Valentinian, who had never shown martial ability in his life, supposedly struck the first blow, then was joined by his chamberlain Heraclius. Aetius, unarmed in the imperial presence, tried to defend himself but was cut down in the throne room. The last effective defender of the Western Empire was murdered by the emperor who depended on him, in a fit of jealous rage over suspicions that were probably groundless. Why did Valentinian kill the only general capable of defending the Western Empire? The sources are unclear. Valentinian was weak, jealous of Aetius's military reputation, possibly manipulated by courtiers who feared Aetius's power. An ancient historian recorded that a court official told Valentinian afterward, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." The courtier was Petronius Maximus, a wealthy senator who had encouraged Valentinian to kill Aetius. Within months, Maximus would orchestrate Valentinian's own assassination, seize the throne himself, and rule disastrously for less than 3 months before being torn apart by a Roman mob during the Vandal sack of 455 CE. The Western Empire had entered its final chaotic phase where emperors were made and unmade in months, and real power existed only in fragments held by whoever could command local military force. Valentinian himself was assassinated 6 months later by Aetius's bodyguards. With both emperor and general dead, the last functional leadership of the Western Empire was gone. What followed was chaos. Between 455 and 476 CE, the Western Empire had 9 different emperors, most lasting less than 2 years. They were puppets of Germanic generals, of the Senate, of regional strongmen. Real power no longer lay with the emperors in Italy, but with Germanic kings ruling what had been imperial provinces. In 455 CE, Gaisaric's Vandals sailed from Carthage and sacked Rome a second time. This sack was far more thorough than Alaric's. For 2 weeks, the Vandals systematically plundered the city, stripping temples and palaces of everything valuable. They carried off thousands of captives, including the empress and her daughters. The city was left devastated. The Vandal sack lacked even the restraint that Alaric's Christianity had imposed. Gaisaric was an Arian Christian, considered heretical by the Catholic Romans, and felt no particular reverence for Roman churches. His warriors spent 2 weeks systematically looting. They stripped bronze tiles from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter. They carried off the sacred Jewish vessels that Titus had brought from Jerusalem 4 centuries earlier. They took imperial regalia, works of art, anything portable and valuable. They enslaved thousands. From this sack came the word vandalism, the deliberate destruction of cultural property. Whether fair to the historical Vandals, who were extracting wealth, not destroying for destruction's sake, the term reflects how Romans viewed the violation of their city. The Western Empire had become a fiction. Imperial authority barely extended beyond Italy, and even there it was contested. Gaul was divided among Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks. Hispania was Visigothic. Britain had vanished into post-Roman warlordism. North Africa was Vandal. Most of Italy north of Rome was controlled by Germanic foederati. The Eastern Empire, wealthier and more stable, watched from Constantinople but sent no help. Eastern emperors occasionally issued proclamations recognizing Western emperors, but this was diplomatic theater. The Eastern government had concluded that the Western provinces were indefensible and not worth the cost of reconquest. The final emperors were child puppets controlled by Germanic generals. Racema, a general of Gothic Suebic descent, made and unmade emperors for 16 years, effectively ruling Italy while maintaining the fiction of Roman authority. After Ricimer's death, other Germanic generals continued the pattern. In 475 CE, a general named Orestes elevated his teenage son to the imperial throne. The boy's name, ironically, combined the names of Rome's founder and first emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The diminutive Augustulus, little Augustus, was contemporary mockery. He was perhaps 14 years old, utterly powerless, a symbolic figurehead. Orestes had done this to secure his own power, but he made a fatal mistake. He refused to grant land in Italy to the Germanic foederati soldiers who formed his army. These soldiers, primarily Heruli and Syrian warriors, wanted the same treatment that federates in Gaul and elsewhere had received, settlement on Roman land with tax exemptions. They were tired of being mercenaries. They wanted what Roman soldiers had traditionally received, land grants that would make them landowners, farmers, citizens, with stake in the territory they defended. Orestes, attempting to preserve Italy for Italians, refused. It was Rome's final attempt to maintain ethnic distinction between Romans and barbarians, and it failed because Rome no longer had the power to enforce such distinctions. The commander of these forces was named Odoacer. He was the son of one of Attila's former lieutenants, a Germanic chieftain who had served in Roman armies. When Orestes refused the land demands, Odoacer's soldiers murdered him and marched on Ravenna. On September 4th, 476 CE, Odoacer entered Ravenna and deposed Romulus Augustulus. The boy emperor was not killed. Odoacer pensioned him off to a villa in Campania, where he lived quietly for decades. There was no battle, no dramatic siege, no apocalyptic end. One Germanic general replaced another. The mechanics of power had simply become visible. What made this different was Odoacer's decision afterward. Rather than elevate another puppet emperor, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, the official insignia, to Constantinople. He informed the Eastern Emperor Zeno that the West no longer needed its own emperor. Odoacer requested recognition as patrician and king of Italy, ruling theoretically on behalf of the Eastern Emperor, but in practice independently. Zeno, dealing with his own problems in Constantinople, pragmatically accepted this arrangement. From the Eastern perspective, Odoacer was simply another Germanic general governing former Roman territory like the Visigothic king in Gaul or the Vandal king in Africa. The difference was that Odoacer ruled Italy itself, but this was a distinction of degree rather than kind. This is the traditional date of the fall of Rome, September 4th, 476 CE. The last Western Roman emperor had been deposed. The imperial office was vacant. The Western Empire had ceased to exist as a formal political entity. Yet here is the remarkable thing. Almost no contemporary source marks 476 CE as particularly significant. The Eastern Empire continued. The Senate in Rome continued meeting. The Bishop of Rome continued administering church affairs. Life went on. No contemporary chronicle says, Rome fell today. The event that would dominate historical consciousness for 16 centuries passed with barely a notice from those who lived through it. They had witnessed so many coups, so many puppet emperors, so many Germanic generals seizing power that Odoacer's coup seemed like just another in a long series. Only in retrospect would historians recognize 476 CE as the moment when the Western Empire ceased to exist, even as a legal fiction. In the Eastern Empire, they still called themselves Romans. The emperor in Constantinople was still Basileus ton Romaeon, emperor of the Romans. Latin was replaced by Greek as the administrative language, but Byzantine identity remained fundamentally Roman until Constantinople itself fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 CE. In the West, Germanic kings ruled what had been Roman provinces, but they preserved Roman administrative structures, Roman law, Roman titles. Theodoric, the Ostrogoth, who conquered Italy in 493 CE and killed Odoacer, styled himself as Rome's heir. He employed Roman administrators, maintained Roman law for Roman citizens, and preserved Roman buildings and institutions. Theodoric's reign represented the ambiguous reality of post-Roman Italy. He was a Germanic king ruling through military force, but he governed using Roman administrative structures, employed Roman senators as advisors, patronized Roman learning, and maintained the physical infrastructure of Roman civilization. His palace in Ravenna featured Roman architecture and mosaics. His court included the last Roman philosophers and poets. He preserved the Senate and the consulship, though they were now ceremonial. This was not Roman civilization continuing unchanged, but neither was it simple barbarian conquest. It was something hybrid, a Germanic military elite governing a Roman society using Roman methods. The question of when Rome fell is therefore complicated. Did it fall in 410 CE when Alaric sacked Rome, in 439 CE when Africa was lost, in 476 CE when the last Western emperor was deposed, in 480 CE when Julius Nepos, the last emperor recognized by Constantinople, was murdered in Dalmatia? Or did it never fall at all but gradually transform into the medieval kingdoms of Western Europe? The answer depends on what you mean by Rome. If Rome was a specific political structure centered on an emperor in Italy, then it fell in 476 CE. If Rome was a civilization defined by its laws, its language, its urban culture, its economic integration, then the fall was a process lasting centuries, varying enormously by region. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale of what was lost. Cities throughout the western provinces shrank dramatically. Rome itself, which may have had a population approaching 1 million in the 2nd century, had perhaps 30,000 inhabitants by 550 CE. Urban population decline of 90% was common. The physical decay was staggering. Aqueducts requiring constant maintenance broke and were not repaired. Cities that had enjoyed running water for centuries reverted to wells and cisterns. The elaborate bath complexes closed, public buildings decayed, streets went unpaved. The urban infrastructure that had defined Roman civilization simply stopped being maintained. In some cities, people built hovels inside abandoned Roman buildings, huddling in corners of structures they no longer understood how to maintain. In others, the population relocated entirely, abandoning the Roman street plan for defensive hilltop settlements. The archaeological layers tell the story, a thick deposit of Roman civilization, pottery, coins, building materials, then a sudden thinning, then a layer of early medieval material culture that is qualitatively different. Long-distance trade collapsed. The Mediterranean, which had been a unified economic zone for centuries, fragmented into regional markets. The pottery evidence is telling. In the 2nd century CE, North African pottery appears in Britain, standardized across the empire. By the 6th century, each region produced only for local consumption. African red slip pottery, mass-produced and traded throughout the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, provides archaeological evidence of economic integration. Standardized designs made in North African workshops appear in excavations from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The trade networks required to distribute such pottery across thousands of miles were sophisticated and reliable. By the 6th century, this pottery is absent from northern sites. Each region produced cruder, unstandardized ceramics for purely local use. The economic integration that had characterized Roman civilization had dissolved. Literacy rates plummeted. The production of manuscripts declined catastrophically. The number of texts copied in the 6th century CE was perhaps 1% of the number copied in the 1st century CE. Knowledge was being lost faster than it could be preserved. Classical literature survived the fall of Rome by the narrowest of margins. Many texts survived because a single manuscript was preserved in a single monastery, copied by a single scribe. If that manuscript had been lost by fire, warfare, or simple neglect, the text would be lost forever. We have lost far more classical literature than we have preserved. Authors we know existed only because other authors quoted them. The loss was catastrophic and irreversible. Population declined across the former Western Empire. Estimates vary widely, but a decline of 25 to 50% between the 2nd and 6th centuries CE is the scholarly consensus. Some of this was the plague. The Justinianic plague, beginning in 541 CE, killed perhaps 25 million people across the Mediterranean world. But population had been falling before the plague, victims of warfare, economic collapse and social disruption. The infrastructure that had defined Roman civilization decayed. Roads went unrepaired, aqueducts broke, public baths closed, drainage systems failed. Cities that had been monuments to Roman engineering reverted to pre-Roman settlement patterns. The political map of Western Europe was redrawn entirely. The Visigothic kingdom in Hispania, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, the Burgundian kingdom in the Rhone Valley, the Frankish kingdoms in Gaul, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. Britain divided among Celtic and Anglo-Saxon warlords. These were not provinces of a single empire but independent kingdoms, often at war with each other. Yet cultural continuity existed. Latin, though it fragmented into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian remained the language of education and the church. Roman law survived in codified form and influenced the legal systems of medieval Europe. The Christian Church, organized along Roman provincial lines, preserved much of Roman administrative expertise. The question of whether Rome's fall was catastrophic collapse or gradual transformation has generated scholarly debate for decades. The catastrophists, like Brian Ward Perkins, emphasize the archaeological evidence of material decline, the loss of sophisticated pottery, the abandonment of villas, the decay of cities. They argue that living standards declined dramatically, that knowledge and sophistication were lost, that people's lives became harder, poorer, more violent. The transformationists, like Peter Brown, emphasize continuity, barbarian kings preserving Roman administration, the church maintaining literacy, Roman law surviving in modified form. They argue that the medieval world that emerged was not simply inferior to Rome, but different, a new synthesis. The truth varies by region. In Britain, collapse was nearly total. In Gaul, transformation was more gradual. In Italy, continuity and collapse alternated as different regimes succeeded each other. In North Africa, the Vandal kingdom maintained urban culture before the Byzantine reconquest, and subsequent Arab conquests brought new transformations. Why did the Western Empire fall while the Eastern Empire survived for another 1,000 years? This question has preoccupied historians since Gibbon. Geography mattered immensely. The Eastern Empire's core territories, Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, were wealthier and had been urbanized for millennia. These regions generated more tax revenue per square mile than the Western provinces. The Eastern Empire was also more compact, with shorter frontiers that were easier to defend. Constantinople's location at the intersection of Europe and Asia gave it access to trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and beyond to the Silk Roads of Central Asia. The city's fortifications, the Theodosian walls, were nearly impregnable. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople would withstand siege after siege, only falling in 1453 after the invention of gunpowder artillery made the walls vulnerable. Military positioning mattered. The Eastern Empire faced serious threats: Sassanid Persia, steppe nomads, Slavic migrations, but these threats rarely coincided. The West faced simultaneous pressure on multiple frontiers: the Rhine, the Danube, the Western Mediterranean, Britain. Eastern emperors could concentrate forces on one frontier while maintaining minimal defenses elsewhere. Western emperors had no such luxury. Economic resilience mattered. When the Western Empire lost North Africa in the 430s, it lost its primary source of revenue. The Eastern Empire's wealth was more diversified. Egypt provided grain, but Syria and Asia Minor also contributed substantially to tax revenues. No single loss was economically fatal. Administrative continuity mattered. The Eastern Empire, despite occasional usurpations and civil wars, maintained relatively stable governance. The West suffered constant military coups and puppet emperors. Effective administration is difficult when emperors change every few years, but perhaps most important was a self-reinforcing spiral. Once the West began declining economically, it could afford fewer soldiers. Fewer soldiers meant less effective defense. Less effective defense meant more territory lost. More territory lost meant less revenue. Less revenue meant fewer soldiers. At a certain point, the decline became irreversible. The Eastern Empire, wealthier and better positioned, avoided this spiral. When Constantinople faced crises, it had the resources to recover. When the West faced crises, each one weakened it further. We return now to where we began, to that woman watching her city burn in August 410 CE. She represents something more than a personal tragedy. She represents the moment when certainty dissolved, when the permanent revealed itself as temporary, when people living inside history's arc could see the trajectory changing beneath them. In the days after the Goths left, she emerged from her villa. The city stank of smoke and death. Bodies lay in the streets, already bloating in the August heat. The forum was littered with debris, broken statues, smashed roof tiles, scattered papers from looted libraries. The great bronze doors of the Senate House hung open, one torn from its hinges. She walked through streets she had known her entire life, now made strange by destruction. The house of her uncle Flavius, he had been consul 2 years earlier, was a burned shell. The temple of Vesta, tended by virgins for over 1,000 years, was defaced, its eternal fire extinguished. The Basilica Julia, where her father had practiced law, was stripped of its marble facing, revealing the brick core beneath, a metaphor for Rome itself, the beautiful surface ripped away to show the ordinary material underneath. She passed other survivors moving through the ruins. A senator she recognized, his toga filthy, carrying a sack of salvaged possessions. A woman who had been wealthy, now indistinguishable from a refugee. A child, perhaps 6 years old, sitting beside a body and crying with the mechanical persistence of the traumatized. No one spoke. They moved like ghosts through a city that was no longer quite real, a stage set whose illusion had been destroyed, but which still stood, awaiting its final dismantling. The question she asked, how does something eternal end, remained unanswered because the question contains a contradiction. Nothing human is eternal. Rome's fall teaches us that all civilizations, regardless of their power, wealth, or sophistication, are contingent. They depend on factors often beyond their control: climate, disease, the movements of distant peoples, the accumulating weight of unsolved structural problems. But Rome's fall also teaches us that endings are not instantaneous. The empire took 3 centuries to collapse, varied enormously by region, and left profound legacies that shaped the world that followed. Civilizations do not simply vanish, they transform, leaving archaeological traces, linguistic influences, legal traditions, architectural monuments, and cultural memories. The woman watching Rome burn did not know she was witnessing the fall of Rome in the sense we understand it. She was experiencing a terrible present, uncertain if it was an ending or merely another crisis in Rome's long history of crises. We know with the advantage of hindsight that 410 CE was a waypoint in a longer decline, but she could not know that. She died 3 years later, in 413 CE, during an outbreak of plague. She never learned what became of her husband, whether he reached Ravenna or died on the roads. She never knew that the empire would limp forward for another 66 years before the final Western emperor was deposed. She experienced only her own moment of crisis, not the grand historical narrative we can construct in retrospect. This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson. People living through civilizational collapse cannot necessarily identify it as such. The changes are too gradual, too regionally variable, too mixed with continuities. Only later, when the transformation is complete, does it become clear that a threshold was crossed, that the world changed fundamentally. We live in a time of converging crises: climate change, pandemic disease, political polarization, technological disruption, widening inequality. Some observers see parallels to Rome's fall. Others see these as manageable challenges for resilient modern institutions. We cannot know which interpretation will prove correct because we are inside the process, lacking the perspective of hindsight. What Rome teaches is not determinism, not that collapse is inevitable or that specific factors always produce specific outcomes. What Rome teaches is contingency and fragility. Complex systems can unravel through the interaction of multiple stresses. Decline can be gradual, almost imperceptible, until cumulative pressures reach critical thresholds. Recovery becomes impossible when too many supporting structures fail simultaneously. But Rome also teaches resilience and adaptation. The people living through the fall were not passive victims. They made choices, fought to preserve what they valued, adapted to new circumstances, created new institutions from the ruins of the old. The medieval world that emerged from Rome's collapse was not simply inferior to what came before. It was different, synthesizing Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements into something new. The question that opened this investigation, how does something eternal end, has an answer, though perhaps not a satisfying one. Nothing is eternal. Everything human is contingent. Civilizations rise through particular combinations of geography, technology, culture, and circumstance. They fall when those combinations change, or when internal contradictions become unsustainable. Rome fell because it became too expensive to defend, too complex to administer efficiently, too economically fragile to withstand successive shocks. It fell because external pressures coincided with internal weaknesses. It fell because the solutions that had worked for centuries, incorporating barbarians as soldiers, debasing currency to pay for defense, dividing authority to improve administration, eventually created new problems worse than those they solved. But Rome also continues. Its language evolved into the Romance languages spoken by hundreds of millions. Its law underpins legal systems worldwide. Its architectural innovations, the arch, the dome, concrete, remain fundamental. Its literature still shapes Western culture. Its political legacy echoes in every republic, every senate, every attempt to create universal law. The Western Roman Empire died. Rome itself remains. A permanent question in human consciousness. How do we build something that lasts? What holds complex societies together? When does resilience become brittleness? How do we recognize decline before it becomes irreversible? These are not merely historical questions. They are questions every civilization must confront. Rome's fall provides not answers, but a case study in how one civilization confronted them, succeeded for centuries, and ultimately failed. The woman watching Rome burn in 410 CE could not answer the question forming in her mind. Neither could the last emperor, the Gothic kings who ruled the ruins, the bishops who preserved fragments of learning, or the medieval scholars who tried to make sense of what had been lost. We cannot answer it either. We can only observe that Rome fell as all things human eventually fall, gradually, then suddenly, through causes both comprehensible and irreducible, leaving behind ruins and memories and questions that persist long after the legions have marched away and the eagles have fallen. The fall of Rome is not a story with a clear ending because Rome never completely ended. It transformed, fragmented, was remembered, reinvented, and continues to shape the world millennia after its armies stopped marching. The empire that seemed eternal proved mortal. But the idea of Rome, the question of Rome, the legacy of Rome, these remain permanent features of human civilization's landscape, reminders that nothing lasts forever and that everything leaves traces. That is what the woman saw as she watched her city burn. Not an ending, but a transformation she could neither understand nor prevent, a moment when the world revealed itself as less stable than anyone had imagined, a wound in historical consciousness that would never fully heal. Rome fell. The question remains. And we, living in our own uncertain time, look back across 16 centuries and wonder what those who come after us will say about the choices we made, the structures we built, the moment when what seemed permanent revealed itself as merely temporary. and the eternal city taught the world that nothing human is eternal after all.